Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Over the last few weeks on this channel we have been taking a deep look at the history of the Capcom and SNK crossover games. During this time frame I mentioned that SNK were going through an extremely turbulent time within their company's history. The entity had taken on a lot of projects that did not go financially to plan. This included the failures of the Neo Geo Pocket handhelds, the underperforming Capcom related crossover games on the system, the Neo Geo CD home console, and the Hyper Neo Geo 64 arcade system. In today's video we are going to focus on the arcade side of things, analysing the hardware and looking at where the company went wrong with it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of the Hyper Neo Geo 64 and why it failed. Yeah. To fully understand this story we need to go back a little further than this arcade system's launch, to the early days within the SNK company. SNK's predecessor Shin Nihon Kikaku was founded all the way back in 1973 by Ikichi Kawasaki. Early on in the company's life, Mr. Kawasaki would notice the rising popularity of coin-operated arcade units, so would quickly direct the company to focus on the development and marketing of standalone coin-op games. The entity's name was informally shortened to the SNK Corporation in 1981, before finally becoming the company's official name by 1986. By this point in time, SNK were developing games for a number of different consoles and home computers. In 1988, SNK revolutionised the arcade business by coming up with the idea of a modular arcade cabinet. Basically, prior to this point, arcade cabinets typically contained only a single game, which meant arcade operators would have to remove the entire internals of an existing cabinet or replace the whole entire unit if they wanted to replace the game. SNK's new system, called the Neo Geo NVS, shortened for Multi-Video System, featured multiple games in a single cabinet and used a cartridge-based storage mechanism. The system debuted in 1990 and could contain 1, 2, 4 or 6 separate games in a single cabinet. In order to swap in a new game, all the operator had to do was remove one cartridge and exchange it for another. The MVS was a huge success. Arcade owners absolutely adored it, due to the new convenience and cost-effective nature the units provided them with. Whilst having a good footing in the arcade industry was well and good, the company saw the success Nintendo were having with their home console, so had decided that they wanted a place in the living room too. Further to this, SNK had also observed consumers' desire to have a true arcade-like experience at home, so with this in mind, the Neo Geo AES was born, the company's home console. AES stands for Advanced Entertainment System, and these high-end systems would first only be available to rent or use within a hotel setting. These were luxury consoles. Past this though, there was enough customer demand for the company to release the systems at retail despite the high price point. The system launched at $600 and individual games cost huge amounts too. These were big boy consoles and were the first way to get a proper go at games like King of Fighters, Fatal Fury and Samurai Shodown within the home. The console, released at retail in 1991, was by far the most powerful and impressive console in the world, producing the greatest looking 2D games the world had ever been able to take home. Of course, if you could afford to. In terms of the home console's reach, it had moderate success in Japan, but sales were very low elsewhere. The quality though has gained the system and library a cult following, making games for the platform highly valuable and collectible today. With the moderate success of the AES, this would mean that units were in production up until 1996, and games for the system would continue to be produced until 2004, meaning if you include the period the console was only available for rent, it managed to have an astonishing 14-year lifespan. Production itself would end for the systems themselves as mentioned in 1996. This was because in both the home and the arcade, technology was obviously rapidly moving on. By this point, the Sony PlayStation and Saturn had been around for quite some time, and that year the Nintendo 64 would see release, featuring Mario 64. All of this strongly indicated that the future of gaming would not be with 2D sprite-based games and instead be with 3D polygon ones. Arcade rivals too had begun switching over to using hardware that was more equipped for this graphical style, so with all this in mind, SNK would begin work on all new arcade boards and a successor to the popular Neo Geo MVS board. This new arcade system was first announced in late 1995 and planned for release in late 1996. It was officially unveiled at the February 1997 AOU show, though all that was demonstrated at the show was a videotape containing a few seconds of footage of Samurai Shodown 64, which SNK announced would be the first game for the system. By mid-1997, test units were on display in Japan. Eventually, we would see the release of the Hyper Neo Geo 64 arcade system, which would debut in September of 1997. This new hardware was fully capable of rendering 3D polygons, and was positioned to eventually completely replace the MVS. There was even a new corresponding home console lined up to replace the AES2, but we will get to more on that shortly. This new platform featured a custom 64-bit RISC processor, 4MB of program memory, 64MB of 3D and texture memory, and 128MB of memory for 2D characters and backgrounds. Ooh. The first game made to run on this unit was not Samurai Shodown 64 but a title known as Rhodes Edge, a 3D racing game featuring the ability to play as 4 off-road 4x4 cars. This is an average racing game that does not really stand out greatly from other games that were present in the arcade at the time. For a few months, this would be the only game made for the system, until it was joined by Samurai Shodown 64 in December of that same year. This was SNK's first ever fighting game featuring 3D polygons, which, like Rhodes Edge, was once again distinctly average. The graphics are a lot blockier than fighting games from the competition of the time, and did nothing to set the world on fire. With the release of these first two games on the system, their presence in the arcade was more limited than with many previous SNK games. This was due to a fair few reasons, including a limited launch of Hyper Neo Geo 64 arcade units. A further limiting factor to the platform's presence was that the units were less attractive to arcade operators than the MVS prior. For some reason, SNK decided to cast aside the multi-cartridge concept and instead choose to go with the more traditional one-game boards. Hilariously, this was one of the decisions that would cause even the original MVS to outlive the new Hyper 64. The following year of 1998 would only see 3 releases on the platform, the first of which was another fighting game, Fatal Fury Wild Ambition. This game is notable for being the only game developed for the hardware that would receive a home port. However, the game would be largely panned and criticised, with IGN stating that it is horribly unpolished and the presentation of the game felt rushed. The next game released that year would be Beast Buster's Second Nightmare, a sequel to a game SNK released all the way back in 1989. To me, this is one of the more interesting games on the platform, as who doesn't like a light gun arcade rail shooter? The game is basically a House of the Dead ripoff, and who doesn't love House of the Dead? The last game released in 1998 was Extreme Rally, which is the sequel to Rhodes Edge, offering very similar gameplay. Personally, I think some of the graphics look a bit more polished in this one, but nothing special for 1998. Earlier in the video, I mentioned the multi-cartridge concept was not implemented into the design of the Hyper Neo Geo 64 units. Simply swapping the whole internals out of the machine for another would not work in most cases with this system either, due to the fact that racing games, fighting games and the system's lone rail shooter all required bespoke cabinets for their gameplay styles. Obviously the racing games required a steering wheel, the shooter required light guns, and the fighting games needed an arcade stick and accompanying buttons. In many ways, the Hyper Neo Geo 64 was a huge step back for the company and seemed a poorly thought out business move in general. Moving into 1999, more games would be released on the platform. With fighting games being SNK's speciality, the next game would be another fighting game, Bariki 1. This mixed martial arts game features a unique control scheme and at one point was set to be ported to the PS1. It is still nothing special though. After all, this was the same year the Sega Dreamcast launched in Japan. The next game on the system would be another fighter, Samurai Shodown 64 Warrior's Rage, the sequel to the prior Samurai Shodown game that utilised the same hardware. Like its predecessor, this game too received a lukewarm response from gamers and critics alike, and never really impressed much. After those 7 titles, no more games were ever created that would utilise the power of the Hyper Neo Geo 64 arcade board. With a lifespan of just 2 years, SNK dropped support for the hardware entirely. Games on the platform were both overall critical and commercial failures, with an extremely low market presence. It is reported that the hardware was very tricky to develop games for, and that SNK staff were ill-equipped and underprepared when it came to the development of games that featured 3D polygons. The company's strengths very much lay in the land of 2D. Running up against games from the same genres that would appear on the Namco System 22 board and the Sega Model 3 board, the games looked very primitive indeed, and that is before we even begin to mention the Sega Naomi that would debut in arcades at the end of the Hyper Neo Geo 64's short lifespan. For these reasons, the consoleized version of this arcade system would never make it home, despite being slated to one day compete with the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64. The story of the Hyper Neo Geo 64 is a cautionary tale and a contributing factor to the eventual fall of the arcade giant, and one of many mistakes that would lead to the company going into liquidation. Despite all of this, as mentioned earlier, there was still life in both the MVS and the AES for quite some time, which was due to a combination of the high quality 2D games and convenient multi-cartridge option it presented to arcade operators. In this vein, the MVS was everything the Hyper Neo Geo 64 wasn't. The MVS was convenient, cost effective, and at launch offered some of the most beautiful looking arcade and home experiences on the entire market. The Hyper Neo Geo offered none of these things, which is why these arcade units are not heralded today. So with all of this said, that, ladies and gentlemen, was the story of the SNK Hyper Neo Geo 64 and why it failed. Let me know in the comment section what you would possibly like me to cover on the channel next. I'd also be curious to hear about any of your experiences with anything SNK related. I release videos on fighting game history every Thursday and console related stuff on Sundays. If you enjoyed what you saw today, then make sure you like, comment, subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified whenever I upload new content. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just that little bit less scary, so I'd like to thank you all very much for helping me out with that. Huge thank yous go out to Carl Johnson, JD Robbins, Sebastian Velez, Sint Spacies, Andrew Bazanski, Osobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, RetroReversing.com, House of a Ted, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah. Cheerio.